right, good morning, everyone. Well, good morning. My name is Emil Doak. I'm the Executive Director of the American Conservative, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you, both here in Washington and watching us on the live stream, to our 5th annual Crony Capitalism Conference called COVID Cronyism, How Government Industry Ties Shaped Our Pandemic Response. I think our topic today is fitting for a number of reasons. As many of you may know, it's at the heart of our work at the American Conservative. Our mission is to advance what we call a Main Street conservatism. This is one that opposes unchecked power in government and business, promotes the flourishing of families and communities through vibrant markets and free people, and embraces realism and restraint in foreign affairs based on America's vital national interests. We pursue this mission through our print magazine. For those of you here in Washington, we have our latest issue out on the registration table. Please do feel free to bring a copy home with you. Our heavily trafficked website, our podcasts, we have 3 podcasts now, programs for young leaders here in Washington and around the country, as well as conferences and events like the one you're attending or watching today. Now, that bit about vibrant markets in our mission statement has certainly been put to the test over the past year. We had a roaring economy just over a year ago that has been completely decimated, or at least somewhat decimated, by government decisions, which is a sort of strange thing to have happen in our economic life. And of course, we're still dealing with the fallout of the coronavirus pandemic, or perhaps more accurately, the government policies in response to the coronavirus pandemic. Those of you here in Washington know that better than anyone with our masks and our temperature checks and everything here at the Press Club. Now, of course, this economic response has not been immune from cronyism. Those cozy ties between government and business that so often favor the big and well-connected over the mom and pop stores that are the lifeblood of this country's economic life. Government programs like PPP loans all too often went to established franchises and publicly traded companies, and the biggest companies in our country have grown exponentially while far too many Main Street stores have closed. So we're going to explore today why this happened. We're going to explore the role that government played, the role that cronyism played, and the role that government might have in solving this moving forward. We have a great program lined up for you today. And again, I want to thank you all for joining us. I especially want to thank Ambassador C. Boyden Gray. He unfortunately couldn't be here with us today as planned, but he made this event possible, so I especially want to thank him for that. Our first speech today is our keynote address from Senator Jim DeMint. Jim DeMint is the chairman of the Conservative Partnership Institute, a great organization here in Washington. He represented South Carolina in the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, and garnered national acclaim from conservatives for leading efforts to ban congressional earmarks and for spearheading the fight to stop the McCain-Kennedy amnesty bill in 2007. He's the founder of the Senate Conservatives Fund, which facilitated the election of many of the Senate's leading conservatives, and he also previously served as president of the Heritage Foundation. Mr. DeMint is the author of several books, including Falling in Love with America Again. And as perhaps is most fitting for our topic on COVID in this year of Zoom, Senator DeMint will be joining us virtually over Zoom. For those of you here in Washington, you can see him up on the screen, and he will be through our live stream as well. So, Senator DeMint, welcome. I will send it over to you.
Well, thank you, and I'm afraid I have to say I'm happy to be in South Carolina instead of Washington today, but I was there last week and have to be back next week. But thanks for having me on this program today. And this is a perfect time to reflect on what's going on in America, how this COVID virus affected our lives, how it was used to change many aspects of our life. And we really have to dig in because I frankly believe that America's response to this virus has been the worst mistake we've ever made as a country. And I think history will prove that to be true. Last year, and at the height of the virus, I think the Conservative Partnership Center was one of the few organizations that was open all year. But being there and standing on the sidewalk there at Independence Avenue, watching cars go by with people in the car by themselves wearing a mask, I had to think, what's going on here? What kind of power would it take to get people who are obviously in no danger of others, completely by themselves in their own car, wearing a mask? That type of compliance doesn't seem to fit with the rugged individualism and independence of the American spirit. This virus has changed a lot about our country. Certainly, the fiscal situation, COVID happened at a time when we were already spending too much. Our debt had almost doubled in the last 5 years. And we already had a very difficult fiscal situation as a government, but we've been throwing money around, trillion-dollar bills like it was nothing. Our economy, as we'll talk about today, has been rearranged again, favoring the big companies, putting hundreds of thousands of small businesses out of business, many of them permanently. And as often happens in a crisis, the big government and big business seem to take advantage of this situation in a way that individuals, small businesses, and others couldn't. We're often reminded of what Rahm Emanuel, President Obama's chief of staff, said, that we should never let a good crisis go to waste. And that's certainly true in our history. If we look at where America has been, what the World War I, the Depression, World War II did to drive people towards the federal government and create this great society and welfare programs, a lot of that came from the loss of confidence of individuals and the concepts of freedom, and their trust was thrown towards the government. And we've seen that many times since. I was in the Senate in 2008 when we had the financial crisis, and I remember sitting at one of our Senate Republican lunches. It was on Tuesday or Wednesday, and Secretary of the Treasury, Hank Paulson, came in to make a presentation to us. He didn't have one PowerPoint slide. He didn't have one handout. He stood up there in front of us with very little facts and told us if we didn't give them the nearly $1 trillion bailout before that weekend, if we didn't pass that as a Senate, that the whole financial system of the world could collapse over the weekend. I thought to myself as I sat there that when I started my business, I had like a 50-page portfolio and proposal to my bank to borrow $10,000 to make that case to the banker. And here we had someone wanting $1 trillion, saying if they did not buy distressed assets before the weekend, that the whole world financial system could collapse. Now, as it turned out, Congress did give them that money. They did not buy the distressed assets, and the world economy did not fail. But we spent the money, and it changed the culture of our financial markets permanently. The regulations that followed the 2008 crisis did not deal so much with the big banks that caused the problem. In fact, the regulations advantaged the big banks even more and caused many community banks to either go out of business or have to merge or sell out to the larger banks. And now their big banks control more of the financial assets of America than they did before the crisis. And that's just a good model for us to learn that politicians do use crisis to take more power. And they do it not only for themselves, but big crony corporations that support their reelections. And I'm afraid that it's not only a matter of using crisis to take more power. I'm afraid the political class has learned to create crisis in order to take more power. Now, we may never know how COVID was started and was spread, but it was certainly used in a way that is unprecedented. And we know that the threats, the risk of COVID were greatly exaggerated and mischaracterized from the beginning until now. early on, you could get from the Centers for Disease Control a lot of data, which is hard to get. You would think in a crisis like this that we would get constant data on the demographics who are most threatened, the ages, and everything else, but it's hard to get. But we do know, and even the CDC admitted early, that many of the reported confirmed cases have been false positives or people who had the presence of the virus but weren't infected. We know that many of the deaths, perhaps over half, that are reported as COVID deaths were actually the result of other health situations, pre-existing health situations that were complicated by the COVID virus. Even people with automobile accidents or gunshots, it was reported that because they had symptoms or the presence of COVID, they were reported as deaths. It seemed that on every turn, the media and the political class and our healthcare community tried to exaggerate the threats. The data showed early that the people who were most at risk were older, over 70, mostly over 80 who had pre-existing health conditions, and that healthy people under 65 had probably less risk than the flu. But again, I have to guess at a lot of this because we have anecdotal evidence, but we're not getting good reports from our government so that people can make good decisions for themselves about what their risks are and what activities they can engage in. It seems to be an intentional cover-up by many in the healthcare and the political class in order to create fear. Now, many Americans went along with the lockdowns and the mask, I think, out of duty, out of good citizenship, but many, of course, out of fear and confusion. I talked to many older people around the country who are just hiding in their homes or their apartments and didn't know when they could go out. And it still is. So this is a situation that I'm sure, if not caused by the political class, was certainly exaggerated and used to manipulate Americans. The bills that have been passed, we know, were in many cases to placate the public, to create a shiny object in effect where everybody was getting this small check while the big money was really going to the corporations. Millions of Americans got checks, and some certainly needed it because they were put out of work. But millions got checks that and their job had not been affected by the virus. But this is used just like during TARP was used for small banks that didn't need it back in 2008 in order to kind of placate everyone while the big money went to the big banks. The same things have certainly happened during this COVID crisis. The bigs got the larger share, the bigs got bigger. Let me just read a couple of these things. You've probably heard them on the news if you've paid attention. But first, just the perspective here is we spent more last year, supposedly for COVID, than we spent in World War II as a nation to defeat the Axis power. If inflation adjusted, we spent about $4 trillion to win World War II and to free the world. Last year, we spent about $6 trillion on supposed COVID relief. I remember when billions of dollars not too long ago was big money. Now we're throwing around $1 trillion bills like it was nothing in Washington. But this $6 trillion, just a few of the places that this went, because less than 10% of it actually went to something you could say was real COVID relief for our country. $350 billion went to bail out large states that were in financial trouble before COVID, like New York, California, Illinois. They went, the large part of this money went there. Another 127 billion went to schools with no requirements that the schools even open up. 86 billion went to failing, poorly managed pension plans primarily government union plans around the country. 50 million for environmental justice grants, 112 million for an underground subway for big tech employees in Silicon Valley. You have to have that during COVID. 1.5 million allocated to the Seaway International Bridge, a bridge that connects New York and Canada, very important to Senator Chuck Schumer. So if you look at who really benefited from all this money that has been spent in the lockdowns last year, it was primarily blue state government officials, teachers unions, and massive corporations. Somehow it seems that big corporations knew this was coming. Amazon spent the last 5 years before COVID building distribution centers all across the country so that they could have one-day deliveries. And during COVID, as we all know, when people were supposedly locked down, a lot of the shopping shifted from in-person to through Amazon and other delivery services. Facebook and Twitter and other social media giants thrived when people could not go out and their only means of talking with others was online. So with very few exceptions, it was the big companies that really profited during this COVID crisis. 45 of the 50 most publicly or most valuable publicly traded US companies turned a profit between April and September of last year, when most of the nation was locked down, while hundreds of thousands of small businesses went out of business. And as we can see, as you even walk around Washington, D.C., that many of them have closed permanently. Like the CEO of Nike said that these are times when the strong get stronger and the bigs get bigger. Those are my words. We also saw a lot of hypocrisy from the elite left. Just a few examples a lot of us have heard. Mayor Adley of Austin, Texas, while he was busy telling people not to travel, he was vacationing in Mexico. While New York was locked down, Chris Cuomo, the governor's little brother, was caught walking around with no mask, and there was hardly any public backlash or media coverage. Dr. Deborah Burke told Americans not to travel for Thanksgiving, yet she took her parents and to her vacation home during Thanksgiving, claiming that they needed it for their mental health, as if the rest of Americans didn't. And while businesses in California were going under Governor Newsom's lockdown, he was dining at the French Laundry and Nancy Pelosi was getting her hair done. You know all these stories, and this is just a small sampling of the left, of their hypocrisy of telling people what to do, whether it's climate change or COVID, and they don't follow their own rules. So what do we do about this as Americans? It's important not only to complain about it, but how do we actually deal with it? I mean, Thomas Jefferson warned us, and many other economists, conservative particularly, have warned us that when the economy moves towards big top-down businesses, it facilitates big centralized top-down government. Big government and big business are allies. We see that in Washington all the time. The big businesses have their lobbyists there. They're paying for the fundraisers and the re-elections of both Republicans and Democrats, and they're just in bed together. And most of the regulations that come out benefit the big companies. And when something like COVID is used to do it on a large scale, we can see a fundamental change in our economy that shifts our economics and our government power towards the bigs. We've seen mayors and governors take authority that their constitutions don't give them, closing down businesses, mask mandates, telling people they can't go to church, how large a group they can meet with. We've seen unprecedented authority, unauthorized authority taken at the state and local level, but nothing like what we've seen at the federal level where their dictates from Dr. Fauci and others are coming out with literally no authority behind them, but big corporations following these directions in a way that fundamentally advantages bigs and makes it harder for small businesses to succeed. We have to have a plan of how to move ahead, because this will continue. As we all get vaccinated, we're now hearing the talk of variants that are coming in, and it spells more danger, and that mask, and we can't go back to normal under Dr. Fauci until some unknown time in the future. This is completely irresponsible. There is no reason America cannot be back to normal now, and we need to demand better data from our government on what the risks are compared to other risks that we're used to going out in public, and so that Americans can make their own decisions. We know if we look at states that were heavily locked down like California, compare their health statistics to states like Florida, who were not locked down with similar populations, even older in Florida. And the health statistics are better in Florida than they are in California. It should at least put some doubt in this idea that the government has been telling us the truth about how to best protect ourselves and our families. Just a few more thoughts, and I don't think they've allowed time for questions, but I sure would love to hear from folks today, and maybe the panel can follow up on some of these things when I'm finished. But conservatives generally don't like concentrated power or big government for good reason. Decentralized power creates more freedom. America is a bottom-up country, beginning with the individuals and their families and their local communities and institutions, their local churches, their local volunteer organizations. It's a complete flip of the American concept to have power emanating from the top. And we have to prioritize that concept, that whenever someone takes centralized power, we have to push back against that and demand that our government follow the constitutional boundaries that it has. And the federal government has no power to do mass mandates, at least under normal procedures. And our politicians, particularly on the Republican side, need to begin to push back. In the past, Republicans have not been as earnest or diligent in fighting the regulations, the big spendings that benefits corporations, big corporations. That has to change. We need a political party in America, and it has to be the Republicans that fight for the little guy, for the small business, to make sure that every regulation that comes through the executive branch is at least fair. It creates a level playing field for small businesses, where most of the jobs and most of the innovation occur. We have to confront Republicans right now, because the Republicans are in the middle of bringing back earmarks that are a perversion of the whole concept of limited federal power. We hear congressmen saying, well, the Constitution gives us the power of the purse. It does not give Congress the power of the purse to build local museums and local roads and all the local things that are done with earmarked money. The federal money is for the general welfare of the whole country. The concept of earmarks, I saw it in person in the House and the Senate, perverts the whole idea of a general welfare and puts it into some kind of parochial favor factory where every congressman and senator can rob the federal treasury to take things back home to their own constituents in special interest. It makes no sense for Republicans to be doing this at a time when we need to decentralize money, make sure taxes are low at the federal level so these resources can stay at home. We also need to get serious about antitrust enforcement. This is not the first time that monopolies have basically driven the agenda in America, and that's why we have our antitrust laws. Republicans need to insist that you put these big corporations, these monopolies, particularly in high tech, through the filters of antitrust. And we have to have real government oversight instead of just the hearings that we have where we hear the problems and never do anything about it. It's time that we get more serious about dealing with monopolies that are fundamentally closing real markets in America in favor of monopolies or oligopolies in America. We have to, as I said before, keep a small business perspective, make sure that the playing field is level. Keep in mind that all the regulations that big corporations can easily deal with because they have fleets of accountants and lawyers and lobbyists in Washington. Small businesses can't do that, and many times can't comply can't comply the way large businesses can. And the last thing I'd like to mention, and there's many other things here, is we know we have a problem of politicians who are constantly trying to take more power from the people and from states. Our Constitution is set up that gives states more authority, more autonomy with very limited federal power. States need to step up to the plate here and demand that this power move back from Washington back to their home states, where states can do different things. They can compete with each other for the best schools, the best healthcare, the best environment to do business. We cannot have a one-size-fits-all solution that is driven by this crony capitalism that's coming out of crises like COVID. States can do a lot of things. They can file suit. We see that already happening against the federal government. States can come together, work together in compacts to try to put more pressure on the federal government and federal employees, particularly their own congressmen and senators. And Article 5 of the Constitution actually gives states the authority to come together and propose amendments to the Constitution that would rein in federal power. And I'm afraid after watching this for more than 20 years that could be the only solution, is to hopefully find 34 states that would come together and propose amendments that would be ratified in the same way that other amendments are ratified. But we've got a lot of work to do. We seem to be coming out of this crisis. The good news is Americans seem to be pushing back. They've gotten more suspicious. They're asking more questions. And they're, again, not complying with unreasonable rules that are not being followed by the people who are giving us the rules. So thanks for coming together today and just kind of listening to this. And let's make decisions as conservatives of how we can move ahead at the state and federal level to push back against the power grabs that we see happening during this COVID. Thank you. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to listening to the panel. Roaring applause.
Thank you so much, Senator DeMint, for those excellent remarks. I couldn't agree more. It is time to get back to normal and to look at the power of the biggest firms in our country here. We have an excellent panel lined up for you in just 1 second. We're going to take a very quick break while our panel gets set up here on the stage. If you're joining us here in Washington, do feel free to grab a cup of coffee. Those of you on the live stream, we will be back in just a few minutes with our panel discussion. Thank you. Ready to get going again here. If you're here in Washington, if you could take your seats and tune back in on our live stream as well. We have a great panel lined up for you guys here today to unpack a lot of what Senator DeMint spoke about earlier and go deeper into our topic of COVID cronyism. Immediately on my left is our managing editor at the American Conservative, Micah Meadowcroft. Before joining the American Conservative, he served as White House liaison at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and insisted in speechwriting there. Previously, he was an associate editor of the Washington Free Beacon, and this is his second stint with us at the American Conservative. Immediately to his left is Mark Meadows. He's a senior partner at the Conservative Partnership Institute. Mr. Meadows served as President Donald Trump's chief of staff from March 2020 to January 2021. And prior to his White House appointment, he represented North Carolina's 11th District for Congress for 7 years. Next to Mr. Meadows is Veronique DeRougy. Veronique is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Her popular weekly charts address economic issues ranging from creating sustainable economic growth to the implications of government tax and fiscal policies. She previously held research positions at the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, and the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. And lastly, joining us, we have Chris Bedford. He is a senior editor at The Federalist, vice chairman of Young Americans for Freedom, and a board member at the National Journalism Center, and author of The Art of the Donald. His work has been featured in The American Mind, National Review, New York Post, Daily Caller, and many other outlets. So thank you all for joining us. I will hand things over to my colleague, Micah Meadowcroft, to get our panel going.
Thank you, Emil, and thank you to our distinguished panelists. Of course, we're here to discuss the role of cronyism in the response to the pandemic last year and also the danger of cronyism as we rebuild the economy going forward. As part of, I suppose, informal opening remarks working our way down the line, I was wondering if you could each provide your perspective on your characterization of the response last year. Should we think of them as a series of relief packages, as bailouts, as stimuluses, as a lifeboat? What approach was used and what approach should have been used in our economic response to the restrictions of the economy in the pandemic? And we'll start with you, Mr. Meadows.
Well, obviously, I had a seat at the table for part of this, and when you say a seat at the table, Secretary Mnuchin and I actually would sit down across from Leader Schumer, Speaker Pelosi, Leader McConnell, and Leader McCarthy. And so when you look at this, was there an element of it that was stimulus? Yes. Was there an element of it that was just pure pork? Yes. Was there an element of it that was required? Yes, but a much smaller element of what was required versus what ultimately was passed. And the danger of that, I think, is that we're seeing not only trillions of dollars going out, but we're seeing breaking the logjam, so to speak, of any fiscal restraint that we've seen in Washington, D.C. You've seen it not only with the $1.9 trillion COVID relief, which had very little COVID relief. It had all kinds of special interests in Democrat, far left leaning projects. But even today, they're announcing another $2.1 trillion event. That's in addition to the $2 trillion plus infrastructure package they have, and I keep putting them in air quotes because none of that is accurate. Being a member of Congress, never underestimate a member of Congress's ability to properly name something in a positive way that has nothing to do with the bill. And I can tell you that what we're seeing is not only $6 trillion worth of money that's been pumped into the economy already, but probably another $4 to $6 trillion that's coming down the pike. And it's extremely troubling for me. So the second axiom there is never underestimate the ability for those on the left to use a crisis to do unfettered spending. And so both of those were problematic. I can tell you, being at the table, it was balancing the real need with a lot of the wish list. And I got less than flattering things said about me a number of times in the press by Speaker Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, that I was the guy that kept saying no. And as I kept saying no, what we found are some of the things that I said no to actually passed just a few weeks ago, as they did that on a partisan basis, working through Congress. But hopefully we'll be able to dive into that a little bit further.
Veronique.
So I guess like the best way to describe it was too big, not targeted, and really it was a wish list of. I mean, when you look at the wage and salary just even imagine that the entire thing was going to be a rescue as it was presented to people who've lost their salaries and wages because of the lockdowns and because of the virus, those two things working together. I mean, the amount of money that was spent in even just through the individual part of the bill was 4 times more than what ended up having been lost. So it was just, there was no measure from the beginning in the scale of this thing that could actually be justified with the needs that was presented. I think the best way to describe it is like people were panicking and they were throwing everything at the problem as possible. This is how you got individual check, unemployment benefit at the same time, which kind of defies a little bit the purpose, especially when you're gonna also have federal paid leave and all sorts of things. I mean, they're all accumulation of and triple dipping of government payment. And of course, we shouldn't, first, I'd like to say, by the way, that there was no way this could be stimulative in any way, shape, or form. Because the notion of stimulating the economy, I mean, in a pure Keynesian neoclassical type of way, comes from actually inducing demand. And when the economy is closed, or even hindered by the fact that people were scared, but in this case, it was actually really closed, there's no way you can stimulate the economy, which made it a total joke that from the beginning it was called a stimulus bill. Because it was called the stimulus bill, I mean, just a lot. But, and the last point I will make is that every single bill, especially the big ones that go through Congress, and many individual projects that are appropriated every single year, are filled with cronyism and crony programs. There are entire agencies that are crony by nature. The Export-Import Bank is one of them. I mean, there are so many, right? And so we shouldn't be surprised, because the nature of Congress is to actually cater to special interests who have an interest in receiving all that stuff and are willing to actually extend a lot of lobbying power to try to actually make their needs known. And when I say needs, I should say wants, because it's not necessarily that they need it. When you extend capital to companies that actually have no problem having access to capital, it's just more a want, because you want a loan with better terms. It's not that you actually need it. This is how Congress works. So we shouldn't be surprised that such a big part of the response to COVID was rooted in serving special interests, and we certainly shouldn't be surprised that it went to all the same players as it always goes to, because those people are connected. They already have access.
Chris?
Yeah, I'm also not too pleased with how this went. I mean, this was supposed to save small businesses and keep people employed and just keep people above water for 2 weeks or a month, or, you know, they just went to Governor Whitmer and said, you guys need to shut down again for 2 weeks to slow this curve. It's like, what do I have Alzheimer's? I mean, am I the president? I'm not gonna do that again. But if this had worked and small businesses had been able to survive through this, we wouldn't have 50% of small businesses in New York estimated right now gone and never returning. You wouldn't be driving through Washington right now and see boarded up, and they're not just boarded up. If you can peek through those windows, they're empty. These businesses are cleared out. there's very little there left. For those who live on the hill, you lost, it wasn't just the nice ones or the easy, cheap ones. We lost everything from the dive bar to the pizza place to Acqua al Due, the Italian restaurant where everyone liked to go, whether on a date night or on a night out of work on the hill. So it obviously completely failed in that regard. Meanwhile, the big guys got all the money. Because they had the lawyers and they had the bigger loans, and I understand it. They're also huge employers, a lot of these big chains. But at the end of the day, what makes these small restaurants and bars and all these places that have been crushed more important than just jobs and just a kid working at Chili's, no matter how many people they employ, is that those are the centers of community, some of the very few remaining centers of community that we have left in the United States. They sponsor our sports teams. There are special date nights. They're where you take the kid maybe for a big birthday. They are a part of the community. You know the owners. It's not a manager who goes in and out. They're a place where you share special memories. And our Main Street was essentially wiped out by this while our major corporations got stronger. And I think also the stimulus, one of the problems with it was, aside from what Veronique just went through, which is it wasn't a stimulus, couldn't have been a stimulus, is that it went through an actually improper mechanism. Most of these companies, these restaurants, these bars in almost any state that I'm aware of, are required to have insurance. They have to pay. Friends of mine who've been wiped out in DC in the restaurant industry where I spent 10 years had calculated how long it would take, how much money they would need to survive a year of no business, and they paid for it. It wasn't cheap. And when they went to these insurance companies, they were told, well, this is a pandemic, and you didn't opt in for the special pandemic insurance, which they added after SARS came through. But for those major companies, and there are some of them out there, some major ones and small ones, who were paying for the pandemic insurance, they went to the insurance companies, and the insurance companies said, well, this is a government action. This isn't covered by your pandemic insurance. So all these companies have been paying in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars every year to have the insurance, to have the mechanism, to have the money that they need. It's not a few $1,000s, $10,000, $100,000 in 3 months if you keep everyone employed. It's the money that they would have needed right then, and they calculated out. And they were unable to get it. They had been unable to get access to that. It would have made a huge difference. And almost every single restaurateur I speak to in the DC area and outside of DC, in Boston and in New York, so that those kind of things would have kept them afloat. That's one of the targeted approaches that people didn't want, because people didn't really want at that point to spread out, it seemed like, this inflicting more pain. Republicans were loath to basically bankrupt the insurance companies by forcing them to do that. Democrats weren't necessarily in power. That was, I think, a serious oversight. They chose the incorrect. The banks are the best way to get that money out for just handing out cash, but the incentives would align for the big guy to get it first, the small guy to get it last. We've seen the result of this, and at the same time, the companies that everyone's been paying into have skated away from this, and we're going to see the result, which is an America without a Main Street. I mean, it was already fading. Our churches were already at low attendance. Our Main Street was already struggling. Our retail was already struggling. We had very few places where America would come together, where people would actually see each other. And this started out with big corporate slogans of "we're all in this together," which was total BS. We're not all in this together. The guys over at Amazon are not in this with you. The guys over at IBM are not in this with you. The guys who are pouring in all this money and have survived this and have had the access to power are not in this. And the small businesses, because of that, have completely failed, and they're still being lied to. And now, I guess we can get to this later, just a sneak peek, they're being used as tools by the corporations and the government to try and instill a whole new COVID vaccine passport regime, and that'll be, I think, the next round of cronyism, but we can get to that later.
Before Mark tells us why we couldn't get a better response, Veronique, could you outline what you think might have been a more sensible approach to addressing, I mean, obviously it's a government-inflicted recession, but both in what kind of more sensible restrictions might have looked like and also more sensible financial support might have looked like over the last year?
So it should have been much smaller. First, there should have been actually pausing and thinking about what is truly needed is always a good thing, but that just doesn't seem to apply to Congress. And I mean, I understand there was a sense of panic, but having a much more targeted approach, one that is, that's not triple dipping, for instance, on the individual side. Either you just focus on unemployment benefits, or you do individual payment, or individual payments have an advantage that it actually kind of covers all your bases, right? And it's less paternalistic. Maybe it doesn't have all the disincentive to not work. I don't know. We have to understand that every government intervention has a problematic side, right? But on the corporate side, we really have to understand that you can't keep an economy on ice for very long. And the way, for instance, like if we talk about the payroll protection program, I thought actually it was very badly designed. It was just, it tried to come with actually string attached that were making it harder, especially at the time where you had an unemployment benefit that was actually creating a hard time for employers to keep their programs. It was, as you said, it was really a system first going through the Small Business Administration that is known to be a disaster during time of disasters, to give that program, that gigantic program, and to give it at a scale that SBA can't even find its way through a disaster when the disaster is small. So it was just, it made no sense in the first place. But because of the SBA, the way it works, it had to work through the banks. And what it meant is only the companies that actually had prior existing relationship with SBA lenders, for the most part, could get a loan. Who would that be? Well, that'd be the bigger companies. First, those also who had a staff to take the time to go through all the hoops to actually apply for SBA loan. One of the things that people fail to consider is 81% of companies that are considered small in America have no employees. It's just kind of a one-man show. Well, when you're trying to save your company, you don't have time to actually do all the junk that SBA wants you to do to have access maybe to some loans down the road. And of course, the second round of PPP, they were we're going to address this. We're going to address this and make sure that the small guys, actually, that the loans can go through smaller banks and all this. But that was 6 months later. So it was already too late. So my colleague Arnold Kling and I proposed a program against no silver bullet. No silver bullet at all, because there's no silver bullet when the government is closing the economy. And also, let's face it, when there's a virus that people are scared of and don't really want to interact and go out, and that is of a government-backed line of credit. It would have to be repaid, but it would actually go to everyone who had a bank account. And you can scrap everything else, and basically what you would do, you would have those line of access open for each one with a checking account. With the amount of the line of credit would be the 2 months, before the pandemic of money that went through this, and people would have to repay it. It'd be a low risk. It would be a low interest loan. So basically, and then after, banks are actually fairly good at getting their money back. And then if it didn't work, you would turn it over to the IRS. They're also not too bad at getting their money back. So the advantage of this is there's none of that crap about being, telling who can, who cannot. You have a bank account, it's a given. It also gives an incentive for people who can do differently and survive not to use it. It also allows not the rush to get PPP, precisely because you can actually use the line of credit exactly when you need it. But again, this is not a silver bullet. This doesn't help you much if the economy stays closed for a year. And I was like looking at numbers yesterday, there's still 25% on average of small businesses that are closed, and medium businesses that are closed in the US. And it's just like, I don't know how you survive.
Yeah, thank you. Mark, can you tell us how the sausage gets made? Or
Yeah,
doesn't?
so let me push back a little bit on a couple of things that were said. There are two kinds of people that love to spend money in Washington, D.C., Democrats and Republicans. And so if you understand that, that's part of the problem we have here, is that everybody loves to spend money. I will push back a little bit on a couple of things that were said, because this was a government taking. Pure and simple, this was a government taking. When we shut down the economy, it was not the fault of a restaurant owner that all of a sudden they had no demand side. So when we talk about demand side, supply side, you look at economics in a very different way. I can tell you we had a number of conversations in the White House where really at that point President Trump wanted to make sure that the big players didn't get all the advantage, and that it was those very individuals that Verdi and others have indicated needed to get the help. But how the sausage is made, to your point, Mike, when we went in, there was a time in April and May where if I were to say that the very existence of our Western economy was at great risk. It was at great risk because of the 15-day, 30-day lockdown that followed that. It was unnatural. It was catastrophic. We had to give you an idea of how much it locked down and why I think we're still seeing some of the real problems that remain. Vehicular traffic that came in from Connecticut and states to the north of New York was down 95%. So literally it was much more of a lockdown than we ever imagined that would have taken place. In fact, when you looked at the mitigation efforts, there was a hope that you would get people to comply with about 50%. That what we started to see is there was this unnatural of what is essential and what is not essential. Let me just tell you, when it talks about a paycheck going home, every job is essential when you look at providing for your family. And somehow we do pick winners and losers, and it is not a surprise to anybody on the panel here that when Congress acts, that all of a sudden you had winners and losers. You had a big bailout for airlines. You had the big corporations that were able to take advantage of trillions of dollars that were coming that way. I will push back one little item in terms of one of the surprises that we had. Had to do with the PPP. I was in the real estate business. I did 0 SBA loans just because they were so problematic and laborious and difficult to ever. As a small business guy, it was easier for me to work with a local bank than it was with the federal government on an SBA side of things. But I will say that the biggest surprise for us is that the local banks, the community banks, did a far better job of actually getting money in the hands of the small business owner. And if you look at the real stats on what happened is Chase, who was this behemoth, had this unbelievable backlog. In fact, I had a brother-in-law that called me, and they had put in for a PPP loan with one of the big players that was out there. I think that was Citicorp at the time. And they were in this queue that couldn't get done, where these small banks were just ripping it out, and they were actually going well. And so there was two different sides. Even though the SBA was part of it, there was an abbreviated. And it just shows when you bring regulation down. There was only 8 components to actually get a PPP loan. It's why the Secret Service now is looking at all the fraud that has gone out there. You know, when they're looking at the financial fraud that's going on, they're investigating even today. But basically 8 questions that streamline the PPP process to get money in the hands of small businesses quicker. I can tell you that what you start with in the Oval Office is, all right, here's what we want to do. And then you get senators that started calling the President of the United States who said, we can't do this, we can't do that. There's always, you know, Washington, D.C. is the we can't do anything until they can. And it's normally when the special interest groups getting taken care of. And by special interest, I don't just mean their special corporation that they want to take care of. There's special interests within the government. In fact, I would say that's more of a problem of senators and House members wanting to support their favorite agency in the whole process and making sure that money goes to this pet project, or if they're the appropriator that's over this. And so early on, was it as targeted as it needed to be? Absolutely not. Would loans have worked? Absolutely not. And the reason why loans would not work is because it was a government taking. We essentially shut everything down and we said, you're not going to have any customers, and what we want to do is loan you low interest loans while you decide whether you want to stay. Well, business people, I've had more small businesses than most people in this room. And I can tell you that businesses don't operate that way. What I would do, and I own 3 different restaurants, is I'd shut it all down. And I would wait, you know, hopefully being able to maybe borrow enough money to cover my overhead, but I wouldn't employ people. And so in trying to create the demand side of that is to at least keep them open. And we're seeing that even now. You know, we're here, we're open here today, and we're at a fraction of the number of people that would be in here. And so putting together some of the processes to allow some of those businesses on the demand side to be able to at least open up for a short period of time was key. Where did we make a huge problem? And the president actually identified it before even he signed the first thing into law, was on the unemployment side, where we actually paid people more to stay home than go to work. We're still doing that today. And we even had a deal where if you were an Uber driver, for example, and worked 10 hours a week, you actually could get credit for working the whole 40 hours a week. So we would pay you more for your part-time job than what you were getting prior to it. And I think that's where Verity was going, and as we look at some of that. The other for the sausage making. I can tell you that there were a number of conservative House members, probably they stood together more, but they had less power because it was Speaker Pelosi. But even conservative senators that in their luncheon, you had everybody that wanted to go from 0 to Senator Bill Cassidy, who wanted to go far more than what we ever even signed into law. And so what we have to do going forward is understand that hopefully the lessons learned from this is allow a vehicle that does not provide for a shutdown, because this is not the last time that we're going to face this. You know, once you've shut down an economy, everybody, as you mentioned, you know, Michigan is looking at, well, go down with a 2-week shutdown to slow the spread. The fact of the matter is Governor Ron DeSantis is showing you how you need to do it in the great state of Florida. That's why I've been to Florida more in the past 4 months than I have in the last 4 years. You know, it's normal. I mean, you've got a normal activity. And so you can take the precautions, you can do the things that you need to do. But my fear is that beyond the PPP program and some of the enhanced unemployment or the direct checks, you know, it would have been easier to take all the money that we have and send an $18,000 check to everybody. Instead of doing all these different things, you could have stimulated and I don't want to use the word stimulate, you could actually have reappropriated the very amount of money that we have and sent an $18,000 check to everybody in the country, or you could have sent over $40,000 to every taxpayer and said, you figure out how to do it, and that would have been a lot more efficient way to get it done.
Yeah, but that's not how politics works. They want to get credit.
Well, listen, you're talking to somebody who understands politics
I know.
really well.
They want to get credit from all those special interests.
Yeah, but I would disagree, and there's always one skunk at the party. This is not a thing about getting credit from a particular constituency. This is more a function of not being able to say no to that constituency. And so it's not as much about getting donations to your campaign.
No, but there's a relationship there, and I think Congress spends a lot of time catering to these relationships, whatever the reasons.
Right.
Right. And they're also government in general, and I think there's a lot of path dependency. It's like the thing that's absolutely remarkable is how time after time, no matter how much studies we have that it doesn't work, or how many studies or data we have that there are lots of problems, it is always the same solutions that are put forward.
I would agree with part of that.
PPP was arguably somewhat different.
Right.
I do still think that it was either like too constraining in weird ways, as opposed to be like more general. And it was still, other data about PPP, by the way, first I want to say, you're right about unemployment benefits. 66% of that first round, 66% of recipients made more not working than working. So that tells you it was a big impediment to actually the requirements that we had for PPP. But one of the things also that academics who've looked at this issue have found is like a lot of the money that PPP distributed went to areas that were the least affected economically by the shutdowns, because they were full of industries where workers could work from home. And when they drilled down on actually looking at the industries that actually got the work, again, a lot of these industries were industries in the tech sector, and where you could really work from home in a way that you can't in the retail sector. So there are always going to be problems like this, obviously, and that's one of the problems of the way the money was allocated. We could have actually done something like you suggested with sending a check to everyone through the line of credit, where you don't differentiate whether it's individual or corporations. You have a checking account. You decide you're going to have to repay it. You decide whether you want to use it and when you want to use it. It's somewhat in relationship to the money you used to make. Obviously, a lot of people who didn't suffer, the interest rate would be so low that they would take it even if they didn't need it, but you wouldn't have bottleneck problems, you wouldn't have any of this. Have we learned anything, honestly, from this for the next time around? I don't believe so. We keep going back to the same response, airline bailouts, over and over again. It doesn't matter how many times academics and pundits explain that actually airline bailouts benefit shareholders, and it's not about workers, because if it were about workers, considering the airline own numbers, they would only need $2.5 trillion to actually keep those workers that they said they had to furlough, and not 25 billion. We are going to keep doing, we're going to...
So you meant 2.5 billion.
2.5 billion?
2.5 trillion.
2.5 billion, yes. Yeah, I think in trillions now.
Sweat. The differentiations are less clear every day.
2.5 billion, we're going to go back to doing a version of PPP without much improvement. As I said, we know all the problem with SBA during disasters. These are never fixed. It keeps reoccurring each time, and each time we're surprised. So I'm down on
And
government.
Chris, do you want to add or respond?
Jump
to any
in,
of this?
Chris.
Yeah, you guys, we brought up a couple times some of the impediments and some of the red tape and some of the paperwork and everything you had to go through. But I was fortunate to have a tragic front seat to one of these, a great example of this, where a friend of mine who had a massive catering company, well, it wasn't massive, it wasn't one of the big corporate catering companies, but employed a bunch of people, had a bunch of space, kitchens, jobs every day, weddings, was completely shut down. It was illegal for him to be in business. He also had event space, which is a whole other amount of money going out the window. But he was getting phone calls from one of the investors' brothers all the time. He had all these great ideas, and he was a thinker, and God bless him for thinking. And he would come up with, well, why don't they do a taco truck? How about sandwich delivery? How about a margarita truck, and it goes to people's backyards, and Cinco de Mayo is coming up, and we'll do, this is right at the beginning of the pandemic, and you just hand out pictures and queso, and these are all fun ideas, and they'd seen them on the internet, and they seemed like, well, entrepreneurs being entrepreneurial. But he was looking at some of the impediments to this and having to explain over and over again what was going on. And I had a front row seat to this because he went from living in a beautiful home on Lincoln Park to renting a room from me for free for a few months. It was the amount of debt that these guys go into so amazingly quickly was unbelievable. Professional debt, and then it's the inability to pay for everything. So he had to tell them, listen, let's say I take this couple who are my two best employees, a married couple with a young kid, and put them on this taco truck duty, call them in. They're gonna have to get off unemployment to do that. It took them weeks or months to get on unemployment. It's going, at the beginning when they had Cobra, it's going to interrupt their Cobra. They've got an infant child at home.
Right.
They're not going to do that. She's not gonna leave. And if they get there, they're going to be able to pay, maybe make just enough money to pay a salary for them. And then the problem is, my business is now alive. And unfortunately, my business has to play dead. I'm getting SBA loans eventually, hopefully someday. But I've got all these people who have deposits, these people who have put down deposits on their dream days. It's very sad, some of it. I'm sure we all know people who had wedding days. You know, they put down a lot of money for event spaces, for catering, for all of this. And they say, hey, I need that money back. The wedding's canceled by the pandemic. And these businesses say, well, the money, I don't have the money. The money goes in and out, and I have the next person coming in, and that's how this business works. It's not particularly high margins. So then if they don't play dead, then these people are going to be able to sue them. He has to be able to say, well, I'm not in business. We were actually, about 9 months into the pandemic, got a knock at the door from a very friendly guy from the DC Attorney General, delivering a service saying, are you aware that these people say you owe them money? And he said, are you aware that the Attorney General would put me in prison if I opened my business? That the mayor has said I cannot be open. It is illegal for me to be open. It seemed to take the lawyer by complete surprise. And every single one of these, every single level of that, from the bottom to the top to the government, there was an incentive against really doing anything. Now, that was his situation was not the same as others. You get out of Jack Rose, the great whiskey bar on 14th Street. They have turned into a whiskey store. They're losing money hand over fist. They've tried everything they can to keep a couple core people involved and just to at least deliver groceries to other people who they knew would do better on insurance than anything, or unemployment, than anything that could come to that restaurant. So every business has been different, and you know a lot of small business owners, I'm sure we all do. But these are just some of the examples of that red tape being human.
Well, Chris's point is spot on. When you really look at what happened in America between March of 2020 and June of 2020, and then continues to roll through cycles right now. The average small business, if they've got any reserves at all, it is tough. And so you have this check out there from the federal government. And make no mistake, the Democrats saw this as an opportunity to have small businesses be dependent on the government. It was calculated. It was literally, they want to make sure that small businesses have to depend on the federal government. And what we're doing is we're exacerbating that each and every time that another stimulus or another COVID relief or whatever you want to call it comes down. It is this access to capital that your caterer friend didn't have it. I mean, if you're saying shut it down, you've got employees, you've got people that are unemployed. I work for a very small nonprofit. We would actually have qualified for a PPP loan during that particular process. We didn't take it. We didn't do it. It's part of our fiscal conservative nature. But it was there and available. And so, how many people were, when you say, all right, you have in their mind free money here, or you have you're going to show personal restraint. Generally speaking, people will take free money every time, and so it's critically important that we look at what the government continues to do to keep things shut down. I mean, it's just amazing to me that we have vaccines that we've vaccinated, hundreds of millions of people already, and yet we're still in a quasi-shutdown mode across much of the country. And it's very troubling to me when you start to see where we're going with this. We're creating a new norm that ultimately is going to require more and more taxpayer dollars to keep it sustained.
Veronique, if 10 months of government policy create these, this reset or this depletion of diversity within the American economy, is there a government role going forward to help the little guy in the face of
I bet I can answer for it, but I want to hear her answer.
No.
What's good policy going forward look like?
It's like this notion that we never learn, that government intervention always comes one with string attached, is always driven by politics one way or another, or path dependency, and is radically different from private sector decision. When you invest your own money, it's your own business that's at stake. We keep not learning that lesson. It's like we've been in this mess for a year. The solution now is to open. And by the way, let's talk about incentives. When are we going to stop when the decision to lock down the economy rested in the hands of state governors, and yet it's the federal government that picks up the bill, either through unemployment benefit, enhanced unemployment benefits, individual check, PPP loans, state and local bailouts, and all the rest. I mean, there's like the incentives are just really messed up. When is this going to stop? I don't see it stopping. And certainly, the best thing the government can do at all levels now is take a step back, deregulate, create actually an environment where people, no matter what industries they're in, no matter what, individual case, everyone's different, right? There's not one small business. By the way, the term small business is meaningless because it encompasses like 81% of the small business are sole proprietors, but it also goes to businesses, depending on the industry where they are, like petroleum, that if they have 1,500 employees, they're labeled as a small business. 99.7%, according to the SBA, are small business in America. So we're talking about pretty much something that covers everyone. All these companies are different. They have different business models. They have different goals. They have different everything. Just the government needs to step back, set the type of institutions and rules that actually allows everyone to thrive, and let's see. I think adding government intervention in the name that they've messed it up and now they need to fix it is just never going to work.
Chris.
I generally agree, I think, with all that, but there are some proactive things I think that the government could do going forward, and I don't expect the government to do going forward anytime soon, that would help the little guy. And some of those would be to, just made a list here, break up Google, crack open the Apple Store, crush Jeff Bezos, ding municipal bonds from Major League Baseball, and tear up antitrust exemptions for airlines. I just want to punish the major corporate players so badly. And I really think that taking their boot off the American neck would be a great step for the small guy, some of the small businesses, the entrepreneurs, and especially the free citizenry.
Mark, we won't ask you to speak for CPI, but speaking for yourself, what do you say to Chris there?
Well, there's one skunk at the party on that I see by, don't ever play poker. She was shaking her head no the whole time you were talking, Chris. But I would, the government has created those entities and the monopoly that they are. And if we think that regulating them is somehow going to bring them in, I don't agree with that. I think you do have to break them up, and that's hard for me to say. And I've not been there philosophically. But what we have created is we've created de facto monopolies with the Googles and the Amazons and the Facebooks. We've done that to ourselves, just like we created part of the problem in our health care. Where we've created government health care. Ted Cruz and Mike Lee and a number of us worked on how do we get a health care system that is truly more market-driven and freedom supporting. The problem is that 60%, over 60% of our health care already has a federal component, whether it's Medicaid, Medicare. When you look at all of it, there is not a free market solution there that is readily available as long as 60% of the market here. When Chris talks about Google and all of those and the things that we need to do, the time is now. I can tell you, we spent more time regulating Sinclair, who was talking about buying up a few different TV stations because we were concerned that they might control too much of the narrative. Google and Facebook, make them look like a little teeny dwarf compared to that. So we've got the FCC and the FTC regulating some kind of businesses to say that we need to have a free market, and yet we've allowed a de facto monopoly. So I have come way far the other way, where I agree with Chris. We need to do that, and so for the counterpoint, I'll yield to my good colleague here in the center here and let her give the other point of that. But I'm really troubled by where big tech is going and how much they control it in terms of what we're seeing out there.
Veronique, what would you say to that?
I mean, obviously,
it's okay to disagree.
No, yeah, believe me, I have never any problem disagreeing with people. But first, I mean, obviously, it's not my really area of expertise. That said, I will say that it requires a lot of faith in government to actually assume they're going to do that well. And by the way, I mean, if history...
And I don't have faith in government, don't get me wrong. But I will, let me point out one other breakup, and then I'll let you finish up. When we looked at the telecommunications business, when we had AT&T and ITT, we said, well, they just needed to control everything because it was way too expensive. When you looked at, I'm old enough to remember that there was a long distance carrier. You got on the phone after 11 o'clock at night because the rates went down. You also, I had a party line. Some of the young people, the party line, what's that? Well, you actually cut down on your costs because you actually shared a phone line with your neighbor to be able to do that. Some of you are smiling. You know what I'm talking about. There are others, that quizzical look that you have on your face. You can, go on the internet and figure out what a party line is. But what did we do when we broke up AT&T? We took the average long distance rate from $1.05 a minute to less than 5 cents a minute. It was a competitive environment. We got more phone calls from MCI and Sprint and everything else as they would look for long distance. But when we broke it up, we got free market and we got new technology. All of you have a cell phone today because they were looking for that market share. They had to create technology to make sure that you were still spending as much as you were spending before. And so that's what I'm hopeful that we'll do. And I apologize for jumping all over your sentence.
Please don't apologize, it's fine. So, I mean, obviously Google, Amazon, and the likes, do a lot of things that disturb me, but I actually really have zero faith in the government first intervening against this particular company in a way that's going to be productive. The other thing is, like, from what we know from history, the history of antitrust, is that there's these companies are always presented as these are the companies that will never, ever disappear. And we've known from Standard Oil and all sorts of other examples that actually it is not the case. It's like usually the government intervenes and it like with Standard Oil, it's like the shares are like falling long before, and also like there's this kind of misunderstanding of actually the fact that these companies have a lot of competition within their different branches. And I say this, well, I see a lot of the things that I see them do are things that I don't like. I don't like corporations of all sorts embracing the whole woke movement. There's just a lot of things that I don't. But I'm actually very fearful of the belief that when you give the power of government to do something that you like, they're not going to continue using it over and over and over to do a ton of things that you don't like. And again, I just think you have to be naive to actually think it's going to be done well, especially in this environment. And so that's really all I have to say, because I really am not an expert. But I'm always very wary of the notion of using government powers in this way. But, you know, that's
I agree.
really...
I mean, I think it was Reagan that said the 9 most terrifying words are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And so I don't disagree in anything that we think that the government can do well. Typically, they don't do well. So.
Chris, can you help us pivot to COVID federalism, and just as states diversify their responses and things prolong, how is that going to affect national politics? And then also you mentioned earlier the possibility of vaccine passports and things like that. Is that like, do you see that sort of thing, which is pretty similar to kind of the Chinese social credit system and things like that, is that more likely to arise from state regulators or from private enterprise? You know, are corporations going to start adopting them for personal reasons?
I think it's more likely to arise from private businesses, and I think it's extremely dangerous. And I think that Republican, conservative, or well-meaning governors should do everything they can to protect their people from this incredible intrusion. I think most of us here at some point or another have worked in some kind of public-facing business, whether it's running restaurants or working in catering or working I was a bartender for almost a dozen years. I personally don't think that you have any business running a front-facing business, interacts with customers, if you are not comfortable interacting with people unless you compel them to do a novel injection, its long-term effects are not known, and then also demand access to their medical records. If you're not comfortable doing business with that person without compelling them to that procedure and seeing their records, then you're going to have to basically choose a different line of work from public-facing business. And if you read the left-wing newspapers, the corporate newspapers, LA Times, New York Times, Washington Post, watch CNN, they're all telling you that Republicans saying we're not doing a COVID passport, it's a moot point, it doesn't matter. I don't know what Republicans are, they're fighting windmills out there, no one's going to do this, but it's happening right now in front of our eyes. IBM got a contract from the federal government in October to look at some kind of way to trace people and to follow people and help people get back to work, essentially. And they took it and they very quickly rolled out a technology that's since been put into New York as a COVID vaccine passport. It's not working very well yet in New York. It's sold on their website as something that allows people to come back to work. And people are using it that way. They've sold it, they've done a deal since with Germany. South Korea has done a deal with another company. And the private companies, I'm sure we all have friends who are going through this, are already mandating proof of it right now, whether it's that before the passport, just showing your little piece of paper. So a friend of mine's wife called me earlier this week. They have a young child and they want to have more. And her company said that there's a lobbying firm in DC, well, you're not allowed to travel for work until you get this vaccine. We have no idea what this does to a woman's fertility, to a pregnancy, to anything like that. Absolutely nothing, no idea. And she doesn't want to take that risk, but that means that they won't fire her for it, but she won't have access to promotion, she won't have access to making money, she won't have access to the deals that are required of that job. So that company is now compelling her to do this. The only 2 governors so far who have said, not only will we not issue COVID vaccine passports, but we will not allow businesses to demand them, are Ron DeSantis and I always screw up his name, Governor Gianforte in Montana, who've said, we're not doing this. You will not be allowed to do it. No businesses can, unless you have HIPAA protections, which seems to be hopefully a sticking point. Unless you're a nursing home, for example, who have access and are protected already under this, who have access to people's medical records. You can ask visitors to the dining room, for example, to do this. Other governors are trying to keep their hands off the scale because Republicans, probably rightfully so, have a philosophical based fear of ever making mandates or telling businesses what to do. They don't want to appear to be telling a mom and pop store that they're not going to do this, but they're going to say, hey, don't worry, we're not going to do this from the government perspective, but hey, mom and pop store, if you want to set up a COVID vaccine, that's fine. Now, how the heck would a mom and pop store set up a COVID vaccine? They don't have remotely the resources to do that. They need IBM to do it for them, or MasterCard, or these other companies that are setting this up, these massive corporate databases that exist. So what they're, and will exist with the help of the Biden administration, because they've said that they'll help them. These massive corporate databases that exist are going to do it for them. The whole thing about mom and pop stores is BS. They don't have the ability to do this. And what it's going to do is force this vaccine on people who don't want it, who maybe shouldn't take it. There's a lot of people in this population who I would advise don't take it, and there are others I would say, I'm not a doctor, but maybe you should. And it'll also create a second class of citizens, of those who refuse, who won't have access to commerce, who won't have access to travel, who won't have access to Delta, who won't have access to United, who can't visit family. That's a serious problem, and our governors should be able to defend against that. They should say, absolutely not, unless you're protected by HIPAA at the minimum. You can still ask people's symptoms, et cetera. And that, to get back to federalism, could potentially be a great thing because it would create a patchwork of people who are now closed off to your business if your business demands to do that. If you're Delta and United and you want to jump on this thing, by the way, after telling us that airplanes are the safest place to be in the world, but keep your mask on and don't stand up all at once, they would have demanded that, but they've got hubs in Texas. They can't mess around with that, and Texas said, if you take any money from the government, then a private business can't do that. That will include an airline. That's the way you start to break these businesses, and that's the way you actually get, our old nemesis, the Chamber of Commerce, to show up and say, I'm going to lobby against this. I don't want COVID passports anywhere because that's going to deny my members access to capital. They might not care about what's going on in Montana, but they really do care about the Florida economy. They care about the Texas economy. They'll start to care if it's Tennessee, Oklahoma. The governor of Massachusetts has started to push back, but they won't have the means to. They'll start to care with that, and that way federalism could actually defend us against this. But if they don't, and they don't stop it quickly, then we're going to end up with this as a COVID regime forever, and it's not going to stop with the COVID vaccine. How long is it going to be before my staff don't feel comfortable waiting on your table unless you've taken this woke class and you have this credit on structural racism? Otherwise, I'm not comfortable with your microaggressions. That's just one example, but the different diseases, the different procedures that will be required, and maybe just the coursework that will be required for people to feel comfortable doing business with you is a path to a social credit system that we can stop now.
It's called hygiene socialism, and it's real. I mean, but I actually have a question for you because if it's okay.
Yeah, this will be the last responses.
Yes.
So.
I obviously am against any sorts of mandates, but while right now I see why some private companies would have an incentive to do such a thing, at some point COVID is going to become endemic. It's going to become, and I do wonder whether when that happens, basically the incentives reverse completely, and that it's going to be all these things are going to be unsustainable. But even if that happens, if these have been put in place at the government level, which I think is actually harder to do from what I've read than we fear, but maybe I'm wrong. Do you think that the shift in incentives, which will inevitably happen, because when you realize that actually people are not flying anymore, they're taking their cars, and by the way, with the risk of that, it's much higher. Do we need to prevent the government mandate because once it's in place, we can never leave, even from the system? Is that your? What
yeah, and I've had some pushbacks from some phone calls that I've been able to have with different governors, chiefs who've called to ask my take on this, mainly so they can yell at me about a latest Federal's piece. Actually, it turns out I was like, hey, I want your advice, but it's not really that. And the pushback is against mandates. I would argue that a ban on this would not be a mandate. A mandate would compel action, and this does not compel action. A private business is compelling action when they put a mandate on customers that they have to get this procedure. And this would be a ban, which typically, aside from some of the libertarian folks, most conservatives are fine with bans. They like to ban things. And they also think that it might be unsustainable, this COVID passport system. Like, for example, if you're in Tennessee or you're in rural Michigan and there's one business that has a COVID vaccine passport mandate, and another one that doesn't, most people, I'm sorry about that, are going to go to the business that doesn't have it, and it'll hopefully drive it out. My worry is that most of these businesses, like when you go into a restaurant and you're dealing with absolutely obscene measures, like they're wiping down your chair every time you get up, and you have to put on a mask because you don't give COVID unless you're standing. But it's not because the owners are typically neurotic, it's because they're catering to their most neurotic customers, and they want to make them feel comfortable, and they do anything they can to make people feel comfortable in that business. A lot of businesses, I think, because of that, will feel pushed to have this because you want everyone flying. So you'll cater to the people who are most afraid of flying, essentially, to do it. But it will continue to spread, and it won't go away. I don't think that these people who are afraid, who are neurotic, these people who are so broken that they're not leaving their homes to check the mail without putting on a mask, I think they're broken, and I think that's going to continue. This whole generation that we're raising of children who don't see each other's faces, who aren't in school, that's going to continue. It's going to be part of their normal life. It's going to be, grandpa doesn't wear a mask. Can you believe it? And I think in a while, there's a lot of folks who don't want to go back. There's a whole bunch of the country, like in Florida, that have. But I think the system that's most likely to stay forever is the one that is the passport mandate from businesses. That's the system that's going to stay forever, that you need to give, that breakdown of a norm that you need to have a medical procedure and then give access to your medical records is what would stay forever. And it's not a bad rule as a society to say businesses don't get access to your health care unless they're covered by HIPAA, and you say okay.
Well, and with that, we're out of time, and I invite Emil to come back up. And please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists.
Thank you, Micah. Thank you, all of us. Thank you to all of you for joining us here today. As you can tell, we at the American Conservative are committed to getting back to normal as fast as possible. So please do save the date for our annual gala, which will be in person in Washington on October 7th, featuring a keynote address from Jeff Sessions. You can also find more of our work at theamericanconservative.com. You can support our work by becoming a member there as well. So thank you all for joining us.